I start the recording?
हाँ हाँ हाँ
Momita,
हाँ
Momita, you
yes
can
Okay,
yes
proceed.
okay, okay, okay. So, hello everyone, good morning, and a very warm welcome to Aquafever. After an overwhelmed response of our previous event, 2 days international webinar on aquatic ecosystem prospect and future challenges, we are very happy to announce that we have arranged a monthly colloquium lecture series organized by Marine Ecology Laboratory in association with Aquafield Presidency University. In this colloquium, we will arrange invited talk of national as well as internationally renowned speakers. This will be held in each of the following months. So today is the first day of this series, and I'll request Dr. Shumit Mondal to introduce our first speaker of this series. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Momita. Greetings to all and one and all the distinguished delegates, students, and participants. So today we are lucky to have with us Dr. Samir Damre, Principal Scientist and Head, Analytical Service Division, National Institute of Oceanography, Biological Oceanography Division. His research area encompasses various aspects of microbiology and extremophiles, biotechnology, molecular biology, and marine biodiversity. He has obtained his PhD in marine sciences from Goa University in 2007 on deep sea fungi, occurrence and adaptation, and subsequently did his postdoctoral research work at Institute of Marine Biotechnology, Greifswald, Germany from 2007 to 2009. He has many awards and achievements to his credit. Few of them are: he was awarded prestigious CSIR Young Scientist Award in 2010 for Earth, Atmospheric, Ocean and Planetary Sciences. He chaired the session Omics in Mycology at Asian Mycology Congress, Goa, India, due in October 7 to 10, 2015. He has also chaired a session at 8th International Conference on High Pressure Bioscience and Biotechnology at France, July 2015 and 18, 2014. Session chair at 13th International Marine and Freshwater Mycology Symposium at the Asian Mycology Congress, Beijing, China. He got DST International Private Grant for attending conference in Germany 2010. He has published more than 31 research publications in peer-reviewed oceanographic journal, 3 book chapters and 3 patents, and served as reviewer for many national and international journals as well as for different project monitoring programs. He has guided 3 PhD students and another 5 research scholars are working with him for their doctoral work. Furthermore, he has guided several students for their internship, project work, and dissertation. He has been serving as member and scientific advisory board of Amity University since 2018 and a member board of studies of microbiology department at Shivaji University, Kolhapur since 2018. He is an external expert for Institutional Biosafety Committee appointed by DBT at BITS Pilani, Vasco da Gama campus since 2015. He is also an expert member guiding committee for documentation of tradable and economical potential bioresources and economic evaluation for the state of Goa. With this brief introduction, I am requesting Dr. Damare to deliver his talk titled Deep Sea Extreme Environment. Over to you, Dr. Damre.
Yeah, Sumit. Thank you, Sumit. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible. No
Fine.
problem.
Okay. Yeah. So, good morning, all, and thank you, Sumit, for giving me this opportunity to talk about some work which we have been doing in deep sea environment for past 20 years now. So here I'll be targeting the graduate, postgraduate students, and the early career researchers who would be keen on looking at some other avenue of research. Like moment you say deep sea, people are really not knowing about it much. They just feel okay, we have oceans everywhere, but then what is it that makes it so exciting? So I'll just will be sharing my experience experiences what I've got in this work. Okay, is my presentation seen?
Yeah, please make
Okay.
it full screen.
Yeah, making.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, fine. So when you say deep sea, we really are amazed, like whether we have life there or how is it. We have been reading in books or some comics or some sci-fi movies. When we see the deep sea, we have so much of say those. In some of the comics, they show you have civilizations there. Then there have been science fictions written about it. So what is it? It makes so fascinating. It is because it's an extreme environment. But is it really so? So we'll look at the end of the talk whether it is an really extreme environment or it is teeming with life there. I work at National Institute of Oceanography, which is one of the CSR labs, the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, which is spread out all over India. And we are located at Goa. This is our building. We have regional centers across the both the coasts. We have one in Kochi, then we have one in Mumbai, and we also have one regional center on the east coast at Vishakhapatnam. When we talk about oceanography, the ships or the vessels are the heart of any study what we do. We are blessed to have at present two oceanographic cruise research vessels with us. One is a small coastal vessel called as Sindhu Sankalpa, and the other one is bigger one, which normally we take for all this deep sea work. That's called as a research vessel Sindhu Sadhana. This has been dedicated to nation 6 years back by then Honorable Minister of Science and Technology. Coming to marine ecosystems. So what do we understand by these marine ecosystems? First and foremost is what we will be dealing with. That's the oceans or the seas which are around us. And then most of you being like Presidency University in Kolkata, West Bengal, you might be aware of mangroves. So most of the coastal states are blessed to have mangroves, and these are really hotspots of diversities. So these are the major two marine ecosystems which make up for the diversity. This we have been studying from our school days. That oceans cover more than 70% of the Earth's surface. These are the different oceans here. We will be talking about Indian Ocean, which is the closest to us and which we have been studying at NIO for past several years now. So first, coming to the diversity or marine biodiversity. When you look at the ocean, you just see, okay, this is a beach and these are the waves. But then beneath that water or the waves or the beach, there is a life which is present throughout from the water column on the top to the bottom. And this diagram is giving you a illustration of how the life is divided based on the light and based on the tide, the intertidal regions or the coastal zones. Then you have this continental shelf, which is most of the time corresponding to the euphotic zone. Euphotic zone is where the light penetration is occurring, on all your photosynthesis is occurring, which mainly serve as food for all the uh, predators. Then you have a bathyal zone, which is more towards like after the continental margin ends on the shelf on the slope. And then you have this abyssal zone, which we call as a deep sea, which we will be looking at it today. So this is basically a dark zone, which we are really dark with respect to the light and also with respect to the knowledge what we have gained so far about it. Yeah, although a lot of research has been gone, there are hardly any forays into these deeper parts. You might have more satellites launched or more moon missions done than the deep sea dives, which is really a surprising thing because there is so much to study and so vast area is there, and we are not able to, and because there are challenges associated with it, which we'll be seeing in the talk. So when we talk about marine diversity, you start from the smallest one, viruses. Corona is at present rampant everywhere, because of which we are having these online webinars and not face-to-face meetings. So then you have bacteria, then you have fungi, then you have cyanobacteria, then you have beautiful corals, you have algae, mussels, and the size increases slowly. Bryozoa, barnacles, jellyfishes, some beautiful sponges which are seen in the coral reefs or in the coastal areas. I'll just run through some images. Then you have sea anemones. So these are some of the beautiful creatures which make up for the diversity there. But what are these benefits delivered by the marine ecosystems? Oceans deliver huge amounts of food products and sustainable sources of energy. They are responsible for the climate regulation and they act as buffer for large amounts of carbon dioxide which are released by our industries and by us. Then they also serve as a source for the maritime activities, and these are really growing important to secure economic development and job creation. Like maritime routes are known from ancient times to man, and we are really now making use of it. It is much easier and cheaper to transfer the cargo through the ships as compared to the airlift or to the trains. Coming to the extreme environments, what do we mean really by these extreme environments? Moment we say extreme, we have some of our fixed thoughts, like we say deserts, we have polar regions, we have oceans, we have volcanoes, and there are many more which we classify or we call them as extreme environments. But why do we call them as extreme environments? This is basically because there is difficulty for life to sustain there, but then in spite of difficulties you have life sustaining there. So anything which is not supporting life easily, in our terminology, we call it as extreme. So basically it is where we cannot survive. Like say, we cannot survive in 70-degree or 80-degree environment, but there are animals which can survive. Similarly, in the colder waters, if we are put, we really need thermal jackets. But then organisms have no luxury of these thermal jackets to wear from externally. So they need to have internal mechanisms, which is how they are supporting and they are surviving in these extreme environments. Now today we will be talking about deep sea extreme environment, which is challenging mainly because of this hydrostatic pressure which is found in water as you go deeper down. This is just to give an example of the pressures what we are dealing out. The rooms where we all are sitting and listening and I am talking, we have something called as atmospheric pressure, which is equivalent to 0.1 megapascal or 1 bar. You have negative pressure in the xylem of the trees, because of which the water movement occurs from anti-gravity. Then as you go down into the, you have something like 70 megapascals. It is 70 times 700 times more than what you have here in the fish swim bladders. And then you have the deepest Mariana Trench where the pressure has been reported to 110 megapascals or 1100 bar, which is still, it's quite extreme, but people have still reported life from there. So this is to give an idea of how the pressure, different pressures are existing and where you will find them. In the oceanography, this is like when you start studying marine science, this is the first thing you learn, that hydrostatic pressure increases by 1 bar for every 10 meters of increase in the depth. So as you go deeper down, the pressure increases. This is basically because of the weight of the water column, which is on that particular point, the water which is existing above that. So the pressure is exerted because of that. And as you go down every 10 meters, you get an increase of 1 bar of pressure. That was about the pressure. But what is another thing which makes this deep sea so unique and intriguing to understand? The next comes is low temperature. As you go down, there is something called as a thermocline. I won't go in detail of that. As you go down, the temperature attains at around 4 to 5 degrees beyond 3000 meters, and it is like a huge refrigerator where you have 4 degrees throughout this. So there is no change other than whatever those volcanic regions are there, but that is very sporadic. Then other thing which is very important in terms of which we normally don't consider is like pressure and temperature are the ones which everybody talks about. It is about the sporadic occurrence of nutrients. See, there is no continuous source of food which is present there. It's like when you have food, it's like a feast condition for them. When there is no food available, it's like a famine. So the organisms surviving there, basically mostly the degraders like bacteria, they need to have adjustments in their metabolic rates to adjust to whenever the food is available. They need to speed up their metabolism, and when the food is not available, they need to uh, reduce their metabolic rates to conserve the energy. So these are some unique adjustments they manage to do and they survive in these extreme conditions. Now if we have to study life there, what do we do? First is like you need to do a survey. The survey is possible for larger organisms, but what about the smaller organisms which I'll be talking about, like for bacteria or fungi? So you need to collect samples. It could be in form of anything. The most commonly what we do is we collect the water samples if you are interested to study the organisms which are present in the water column, or the second is the sediment samples which are lying on, which is the ocean floor basically. So how do we collect them? This most of the marine science students must have heard about this Niskin sampler, named after the scientist who discovered these bottles or designed these bottles. So this is a typical Niskin bottle, which is a 5 liter capacity, which when you are collecting the water samples, both the ends are open and then they are sent down, and either through a manual messenger or a electronic CTD control unit which is on deck, you collect this at particular depth where you want to collect the water, and that is how the water gets trapped. This the lids close, and then you get it on top in the lab and start studying. Now this is a typical rosette. You can't afford to send one bottle only, because you are, when you study like different biogeochemical characters or microbiology, everybody needs samples, and it is not a single discipline, it's a multidisciplinary study most of the time. So this is something called as a rosette, wherein you have say 12 or 24 bottles fitted, and then it is lowered to a particular depth, and the bottles are closed at the desired depths to which you want to collect the samples. So this is an example of a water sampler. This is an example if you want to collect the sediment. Now this is a typical Usnel box corer, which is also called as a spade corer. You also have some other kinds of corers available which you want to collect sediment, but this is basically like if you want to grab, so it's called as a grab or a spade corer. But this is the one which this is called as a multiple corer, wherein you can collect your sediment in this tube like things what you see here, which could be of varying length from 30 centimeters to 50 centimeters. So what happens when you send this down, because of the load, this penetrates into the sediment. So a lot of geological survey has to be done before you go for any kind of sampling there, because you need to know whether this has a penetration power, it is going to penetrate, or if it doesn't penetrate, this will rupture, because these are basically plastic polypropylene tubes. So once the sediment is collected inside, there is a closure mechanism, and then you get it on land. I will show you at the end of my presentation some of the pictures where the sediments have been collected. This is a typical box core where you have this liners. This is all from our work which we have done in the Central Indian Ocean. So this is the sediment which is collected. Then you insert these kind of liners into it. Now this is if we are not having facility for the multi-corer. So this is a shortcut to that. So you insert the cores into it after a box is collected. Then you draw out the sediment similarly in the lab and then start working. So immediate processing is the key to do any kind of this kind of deep sea work. You need to have labs on ship, which we have at present. Now that is about if you want to collect just the surface samples, like say 30 centimeters or 50 centimeters. What about if you are interested in looking what is there deep below the surface sediment? So that is collected using the long pipe cores, or called as a gravity core or a piston core, where you have this kind of drilling mechanism, and the sediment goes into it, and this is how it comes on the surface, and then you cut open and say. Recently there have been a lot of papers which are coming and talking about the life from deep sea. The life has been reported even from 1800 meters core, so that's way much beyond human beings also came into being, and they have found some DNA, RNA and protein signatures from that. And these kind of cores are collected in huge amount in an international program called as IODP. It's International Ocean Drilling Program, and there is a repository in Kochi where all these sediment are collected, and any researcher from the world interested can go and access the sample and can study whatever he or she is interested in. So that's one nice international program supported by the Japanese government through the Kochi repository facility. That was about when you are sitting in the ship and you are doing the sampling. What if you are really interested to go and look at down and then collect the sample yourself? Like for example, in the hydrothermal vent region, where you want to see the vent and then you want to collect the organisms which are present around the vent. So there are a few submersibles which have been used by us for that. Japanese government under the JAMSTEC program has this one called a Shinkai. Then Woodsole Institute in US has the Challenger deep sea submarine, and the French government has one which can go up to 8,000 meters. So these are basically manned submersibles. So you can, two people can go down and collect, and it has a extendable arm through which you can collect the sample, and there is a opening through which you can collect and get the sample inside. So basically you are able to see what you are collecting. When you are collecting from surface, like from the ship, which we do most of the time, we really don't know till the sampler comes up. Many times it happens that the box comes empty and you spend 6 hours doing nothing. So after that again you have to try. So it's a expensive and a time consuming process. Here you don't have those failures, but then having a submersible dive itself is a huge cost intensive program. And as of now, even NIO or government of India doesn't have access to this. So we are not in state to do this, it is not mainly explored because we don't have much hydrothermal vents in the Indian Ocean. These are only reported in Pacific and Atlantic. So these are some of the sampling techniques and methods which have been used for studying the deep sea environments. So after that, the basic question comes back: are there any inhabitants in the deep sea environments? Yes, there are inhabitants which have been reported in the form of bacteria, fungi, viruses, archaea, chytrids, etc., etc. There are many small invertebrates which have been reported. I'm not talking about the vent regions which are at say 2000 2500. I'm talking about the deeper depths like 6000 6500 meters. But the diversity is well represented across different taxa with all the inhabitants which have been reported from the deep sea environments. But if these inhabitants are present, how do they face the extremities and survive there? Now, to explain this, I will take example of the work which I have been doing for past 20 years on the deep sea. So there could be adaptations in the form of two. There could be morphological adaptations or there could be physiological adaptations. Now these physiological adaptations could be in the form of membrane composition, organic osmolyte production, or the stress proteins. The basic metabolic functional activities are adapted to function at these extreme conditions of temperature and pressure. These are some of the pictures which I have obtained from the deep sea cultures which I collected during my PhD time. So this is just to give an example. Many of you from school time must have seen when we say draw fungus, this is how we draw aspergillus, typical aspergillus. They will be surprised to know that the one on the left, the top left, the both on the right side, these are also aspergilli, but which are having different kinds of morphological adaptations exhibited because of the pressure from which they have been isolated or from the temperatures or the different extremities. So basically these are some of the abnormal morphologies, like instead of a phyllid and a conidius spore, you have a phyllid and then don't have any spore, you directly have another mycelia which is germinating from it. So this aspergilli is known to produce this kind of adaptations under stress, and here pressure is one of the pressure and temperature one of the stresses. This was a beautiful culture which we got, but we lost it during. Now one of the sad thing about all this deep sea culturing is that most of the time we are unable to culture, and after we culture also there's no guarantee that you are going to keep them alive in the lab. You need to keep them under pressure, because many a times moment they get exposed to the normal atmospheric conditions, they do not survive and many a times they die. This is another adaptation which we had seen, like if you these cultures they are grown under different conditions, like I will come to this. I know some of the people must be having questions like how this is growing here and these are showing abnormalities. There is reasoning for that. These are some more yeast pictures which under laboratory conditions when grown, they grow at normal condition, normal morphology like yeast typical budding. Instead of that, the moment you put them under pressure, so this is actually a stress for the cultures which have been obtained. They start elongation and they start showing abnormalities. The next one, what I said was first was morphological and then the physiological adaptations. Now there are many organic osmolytes which have been reported from these organisms which have been isolated from the deep sea. One of them is trimethylamine N oxide, which increases with the depth in muscles of some of the stelios, and crustaceans. And the reports have it has reached like up to 300 millimolar at 2000 meters of these organisms. So this is called as a universal protein stabilizer. Then hydrothermal vent regions are really fascinating, and that is teeming with life. And we all must have heard about this riftia, which are these organisms which can grow up to 5 to 6 meters tall, like tube organisms. So these are the animals which show high contents of sulfur-based solutes like hypoterin and thiotaurin, in addition of some of the methylated solutes. Then the next aspect which has been reported from most of these deep sea organisms is about the membrane fluidity. So any organism to survive, you need to have an appropriate membrane fluidity. Basically, to give a closest analogy, I can talk about the oil what we use for hair oil. You have seen that most of the time the oil in the cold conditions, it solidifies. So just imagine the organisms, like say you have bacteria. Moment you put them in 4 degrees, if the fatty acids which are present in the membrane, if they solidify, all the exchanges and all the processes which are occurring will stop. So they need to maintain the membrane fluidity, and this can be achieved by increasing the ratio of the unsaturated fatty acids within the membrane phospholipids. So this is one of the most common adaptation which is reported by not only deep sea organisms, the organisms which are adapted to low temperature. Now here low temperature is one of the factors which you are discussing, so I gave that example. Then apart from that, now going deeper into, I was talking about the morphology, then I went to the membrane structure. Now we will go further one step down to the genes. Now there are many of the pressure responsive genes which have been reported from organisms. Most of the work has been reported from Scripps and Woodsole, where they have managed to isolate and prove the pressure responses of the genes which have been reported to play a role basically in the conformational changes in the proteins which are there. And apart from that, you'll be surprised that E. coli is also being used for most of these studies, which it's a model organism which has been used to study the pressure responses in the various organisms, the various processes. Now these are some of the examples which scientists have studied with respect to pressure, but in E. coli, the normal organism which we use for any kind of molecular studies. So they have seen that the motility decreases and it is lost after 10 megapascal. Cell division is lost after 20 to 50. Growth is lost after 50. DNA replication. So slowly, one by one, processes stop. So just imagine if this thing is happening in E. coli and being a representative organism, same thing happens in the organisms. They will not be able to survive or replicate and translate. So they must be having some machinery in them to survive all these extremities and keep all these processes working. So this was like a starter point for the scientists to look into the adaptations of these various processes in the organisms which have been isolated from the high pressure environments. This is just to summarize about what I spoke so far. Like you have this sampling, you have the sample retrieval. This is the Alvin, which was the previous from the Woodsole Institute. Then you have ROV Victor, which has gone up to, this is not manned, this is unmanned, 11,000 meters. Then you have this the skin samplers or the decompressed samples which come in this ROVs. Then you have some pressure retaining samplers, gas tight isobaric, because if you are interested in studying the real pressure tolerant organisms, you need to get the sample also in the high pressure condition from the collection pressure what we have got. Otherwise, what will happen as the sample is coming up, it will get depressurized, and the organisms which are really pressure sensitive will die, and you will not be able to study them. And what you will get will be only the pressure tolerant organisms. So this all needs to be done on board immediately, because it's very difficult and expensive to maintain the organisms or the samples in the pressure. Then you have different microbiology techniques. You have high pressure techniques to cultivate them, microscopy. Then you have the modern molecular tools now, which has really revolutionized the deep sea explorations. Now I will come to my topic, which I did studied in my started during my PhD. Like, we started first with the basic question, like, are fungi present in deep sea sediments? Because the existence of fungi was not easily accepted by scientists across different nations. That my bacteria, unicellular ones, was easily accepted because of these procedures, but fungi, being a multicellular organism, are they really present in deep sea sediments? So this is what we started into exploration. Fungi have been reported from different kinds of sources and depths. This is the work from our group. What we have reported, we reported culturable fungi from Central Indian Ocean of 5,000 meters. Now, these organisms which are there from the deeper depths, many of them are reported owing to the new molecular techniques like the DNA signatures and all. But not many people have gone into the culturable. There are hardly 4 labs in the world who are working with culturable fungi from deep sea organisms, and we are one amongst them. There are 2 groups in Japan and one in France who are dealing with the culturable fungi, especially the mycelial forms, not the unicellular yeast. This is just to give an example of the kind of fungi we managed to isolate from the deep sea sediments. Now, during my PhD, I got around 220 different fungal isolates from the different samplings what we carried out in the Central Indian Ocean from depths of around 5,000 to 6,000 meters. So we could get a huge chunk of aspergilli, different kind of aspergilli. Reasons for that I will talk when I'm going further in the. We also got these are all the common fungi which we reported. Basically, this was the culturable thing, which was so we have a lot of problems for culturing. One example I can give is that when we were doing work, we found that the media what we use normally in microbiology, I think most of you have done some kind of culturing at some point of time, like this nutrient broth or nutrient agar or different kinds of agars what we use. We found that these cultures what we could isolate, they were growing better in the sediment extract medium what we prepared from the sediments which we collected from the deep sea. So there must be some elements in that sediment which are supporting the growth. And then the another question is that most of the time when we give them this rich source of, say, proteins or other sugars, do they really exist in that state for the organism to assemble when you put them under pressure? Maybe they are not available in the assimilable form because of the pressure, the distortion occurs. So that could be one of the reasons we said that, okay, these sediments, if we use the sediment extract from this area what we collected, we could get better recovery of the organisms, and that is what we got in our studies. Now, if they are present, this was about the existence and proving of the fungal presence in the deep sediment. Are they growing in this sediments? So, as I was saying some time back, the organisms what we have worked are mostly the piezo tolerant. This is it is a analogy to pressure tolerant. So it's called as these are pressure tolerant forms. So because we couldn't get pressurized samples up on the ship from the bottom of the sea, we have to contend with only the pressure tolerant. So the organisms which could tolerate the pressure when exposed to high pressure, but are also able to grow and survive in the atmospheric pressure. So most of the work what I am presenting here is for the pressure tolerant fungal isolates, not the true piezophiles. Now this is a typical high pressure microbial culturing vessel which we used for our work, and most of the people across the world are using. So you can see this my cursor arrow. This is the the cylinder in which we put the sediment or the samples what we want to pressurize, and this is a simple hydrostatic pump through which the water is pumped in, and you increase the pressure, and once it reaches the desired pressure, so this pressure simulator can simulate up to 1200 bar of pressure, which is more than even Mariana Trench pressure which has been reported. So we managed to cultivate and grow organisms up to 600 bar, which is the depth what we had got these organisms from. The average depth from where we collected a sample in Indian Ocean was around 5600 meters, corresponding to around 560 bars or 56 megapascals. So if these organisms, this fungi are present and if they are growing, what is the role this fungi can play in the deep sea sediments? One of the roles which we looked into was basically carbon sequestration by means of the aggregation in the sediments. And then, as you know, fungi are very really good degraders. The recycling of nutrients by means of degradation of the complex molecules to simpler forms. Apart from that, we also looked at biotechnological angle for these organisms, through which we, when Sumit was saying 3 patents, so basically these are the patents what we have for some of the enzymes which we got from deep sea fungi. One of them we explored was a cold tolerant protease, which could be used in the detergent industries. Now, when we talk of aggregation and carbon sequestration, it basically helps in stabilization of sediments, very similar to what you see in the terrestrial land also. The carbon sequestration, formation of humic enzyme complexes so as to facilitate nutrient cycling in this sediments, and I'll come to that. So these fungi are present in the deep sea sediments. They grow and contribute to recycling of the nutrients. This fungal macrygation helps to trap the microbial enzymes. Otherwise, what happens most of the time, this extracellular enzymes, these are secreted, and because the fungi are present in water, the enzymes will get diluted, and the fungi, in spite of producing the enzyme themselves, will not be able to make use of this. So if it has a complex which is attached to this mycelial form, the enzymes get trapped in there, and they can do the better degradation of the complex organic matter, which is then further assimilable by other microorganisms like bacteria. And we reported that fungal biomass contributes to around 2.3 to 6.3 micrograms of carbon per gram of dry weight of sediment. So this was the first report of the contribution of fungal mycelia to the carbon in the deep sea sediments, which was accepted and published later on in a journal. But then why was that the fungi were really unreported till we started looking into it in the late 90s? Before that, there were absolutely no work reported from the fungal mycelial from the sediments. Or everybody was talking about bacteria, and in early 90s, like the pressure tolerant or the pressure sensitive bacteria was a big research topic, and a lot of grants were given. Scripps and Woodsole were leading into that. That is the time where my PhD supervisor started looking into this fungal things, and we found an interesting we got an interesting observation that this fungi remained embedded in the sediments, and that is the reason they go unnoticed, and that is that aggregation what I was talking about in the previous slides. So when we treated this and we broke these aggregates, basically the chelations which are there, using simple technique of EDTA, we found that the fungal detection rate more than doubled, and that could be one of the reasons. You can see this difference. If this is seen under microscope, it will be very hard to convince one that these are the fungal mycelia what you are seeing. And the same thing when you treat with EDTA, you can start seeing the mycelia, and we developed a technique using optical brightener called Calco4 to observe this under microscope, which was easier, because if you don't use that, under UV light they illuminate the fungal mycelia, and then you can see it more clearly. So we put forth this theory that fungi are hidden in the deep sea sediments, where they grow and contribute in the recycling of the nutrient. That's the reason we call them as a cryptic presence of fungi in the deep sea sediments. So after that, we put forth this theory, like most of the people were saying, like my first paper when we published, we had a lot of queries asking to prove the existence. Why did you get Aspergillus terreus? So this is a theory which we put forth, that okay, this fungal mycelia and spores, they get carried with the wind or the terrestrial runoff, then they die or slowly sink to the bottom. So it could be in the form of the spores or the mycelia, and the survival chances of spores are much better in the sediment. and then because of the sedimentation occurring in that region, you get these spores embedded deep into the sediments. Now what we did, we have worked with around 50 centimeters of the subsurface samples, but then after us, many people have reported presence of fungi from even up to 1000 to 1200 meters depth, not culturable based on the DNA signatures. So we hypothesize that this mycelia adapt well, and then the adapted forms grow, while some remain dormant in the form of spores and the remaining die. And these spores are the ones we managed to recover and grow in the lab. That is the reason most of the sculptures what we got were aspergillus, beautiful spore formers. And once you train them to grow in the lab, they go back to the original cultures. Like most of the photos what I showed about the abnormalities, these abnormalities were lost when we started subculturing them in the lab. After fifth or sixth generation of subculturing, most of this culture started growing like normal aspergilli. And I was just starting my work, so I was extremely sad and said I have lost most of the cultures. And then we started looking into the DNA signatures, and we saw that okay, these are the same cultures. Only thing now the adaptation, the stress is removed, so they are growing back to the normal conditions. So that's the reason. Like although these are obtained from this region, they may not be originating from there. They must be the terrestrial ones which have got adapted, and that's the reason when you put them back under pressure and stress, they start showing those abnormalities. So these are present in the deep sea sediments. They grow in the deep sea sediments. They cause aggregation. We have published quite a few papers supporting our theories, and that is where we started looking into the next aspects, that how do this, if they are present, how do they survive and grow in the deep sea sediments. So that is going back to the previous slide what I had said, morphological adaptations, or it could be the physiological adaptations in the form of the membrane or the proteins. And that is where we started looking into the next chapter. That is, then after my PhD, my students started looking into it, expression of proteins in one of the important responses which are given in cell, response to the stress it is subjected to. So that student worked on different proteins which have been secreted, and she just finished her thesis last year, where we could see interesting proteins which were secreted by this fungi under pressure. And I'm not going to go in those details because that will take a long time, but just to tell you that we have a proteomics facility in our institute set up by me, which we have used for these studies, where we could the sensitivity of this is around at femtogram level. And the beauty of this is that it can work with just 0.5 to 1 microliter of the sample, which is that premium when you're working with deep sea forms, because you get very less biomass to do the protein extraction. So the challenges started right from the extraction of proteins, and now we have established a protocol wherein you can get good amount of protein even from 1 milligram of biomass, because 1 milligram of biomass also to make under pressure, it takes very long. Like the incubation times are close to 30 to 45 days, and not easy to grow them under pressure. So you just need a very small amount, and you get easily in one injection up to 700 to 800 proteins can be identified if your database is well curated. So why the question sometimes people ask is, okay, what you do, what will you achieve by studying this deep sea? Because it's a deep sea exploration is extremely expensive. Like many of the papers where we communicate, this is one of the reviewers questions, like why do you entered into this foray where it is an expensive, you need high pressure samplers, you need high pressure cultivators, then in spite of doing all that. So apart from understanding the basic evolution, these extremophiles are also very significant in the modern industries, because what happens is most of the time the standard enzymes stop working when exposed to any of these extreme conditions. But if you have got a source of the enzyme, that organism which has come from the extreme environment, it will be having potential to work in extreme conditions also. And the enzymes which are being produced by these extremophiles, we term them as extremozymes. And then it can potentially eliminate the need for these steps. Like if you are having any high temperature or low temperature reaction which you need to carry on, you need to either heat the reactants or you need to cool them. That is energy intensive. So instead of that, if you use an enzyme which is showing activity at similarly high temperature, low temperature, you can eliminate the need for these added steps and save on the cost. So that will help into the industries. So some of the examples of the extremophiles, the most famous is the Taq polymerase, which is forming basis of all the molecular biology work we are doing. Then we did a lot of work on these detergent additives from the cold temperatures, proteases, lipases, amylases, cellulases for cold washing. Textile industry has made use of many of these high temperature enzymes. Food industry is using it. In bioremediation, people are using it. Then another example which I can give, which I always talk about, is the high pressure treatment, which at present world is looking at instead of pasteurization to milk or the juices. In Japan and Germany, there is a huge research going on with respect to the pressure as preservation technique, and you have universities and different departments who are working on that. So basically they are talking about, instead of using heat which is going to spoil the texture and the nutrients, if you can use the pressure. And one of the conferences which I attended in Japan, actually they gave the food for 2 days which were just pressure treated. And some of one rice packet which I got is with me still like for past 5 years, and it is not spoiled even after keeping at room temperature. So, how can you be part of this exciting oceanographic work or the pressure one? The careers in biology, that I would say main. Apart from that, you have other aspects also. So, biologists can learn how the living things work, how they interact with one another, how they evolve. Then this work increases our understanding about the natural world in which we live and help us to address issues of personal well-being and worldwide concerns. If any of your students are interested in joining NIO, you could join for your PhD through two portals. One is called as a DRF, the other one is the ACSR, the new academy started by CSR. We take PhD students for DRF all year round, whereas for ACSR we have applications coming twice a year. Check on our website, you will get the details. Or you could join as a project assistant if you want to gain some experience, or even the students who are doing their graduations or masters could join for a small project or summer training. All these details are available on our website, you can check anytime. Apart from that, if you just want to visit NIO, we now, because of this corona, actually this year we couldn't get, but on an average we get at least 2 to 3 colleges or universities visiting us during the year. So we have special display areas for them, and if they are interested and if they contact well in advance, we also have interaction with the scientists in which they are interested in. So all this could be done by mailing through our PNR. Details are available on the website. Then just to end my talk, before that, at present we are working on a project wherein soon deep sea mining is going to become a reality. Don't know whether in my generation, your generation, or the next generation, but yes, we definitely are working towards it at NIO from 1982. That was the first nodule which was picked up from the Indian Ocean by Indian scientists, by NIO scientists. And now we have reached the next phase where we have started, not yet started, we are still doing the environmental impact assessment, because there is a controversy, there are pros and cons towards it. Like, okay, deep sea mining, what will happen to the environment? You saw in the land mining also there are so many issues. Now just imagine if you go in deep sea and then you start mining. So a systematic study has to be done to support the mining, or say mining should not be done. So at present I am heading the biological impact assessment studies for doing this deep sea mining, and we are working towards it. We will be going for at least another 3 cruises in next 2 years to look into and disturb the area and see what is happening and how long it is taking for the area to restoration. In 1998, one of this disturbance experiments was carried out by our seniors in that area. Now we will be doing a small prototype mining around 500 meters of area, where we will be studying that area every year for next 5 years to see what effect that mining has done. And this all is done as per the guidelines of International Seabed Authority, because these are international waters where which is away from the land. So the international waters what we have claimed for our mining are somewhere close to Mauritius, 12 to 16 degrees south in the southern hemisphere. and already that is given to India for doing all these studies. So mining is will take very long time, but then at present the studies are going on to look into how, whether the mining is sustainable, not sustainable. Then the next question comes about the profit or loss. So first, the environmental sustainability is key for any kind of this experiments when we do. So as a part of that, we recent last, this was some of the photos of last cruise I will show you before the end of my talk. So this is the vessel what I was talking about. This is 80 meters long vessel with the capacity of 56 people. So around 28 crew and 28 scientists can go on this. So typically around 20-25 people minimum sail, because it's a multidisciplinary cruise. Like physics biologists are there, geologists are there, chemists are there. These are the real pictures of those Niskin samplers what I showed you. So this is a 24 bottle rosette. So you can send 24 bottles at a time. Each bottle is having 10 liters capacity. So you can collect 240 liters of water, which can be shared by everybody. This is an example of a multiplankton net. Now this is used to collect the zooplankton, the planktonic life which is present in the water. So basically this is lowered down and the water rushes in here from top, and then there is a mesh of size of say what 100 microns or 200 microns which traps the organisms of your interest. This is the example of that multi-core what I was telling you about. So this is the sediment filled in there. This is me and my student, the ship crew, and then we get it in the lab and then we start extruding this out. So we collect this water, which is very important to look into. What is this? Is the interface where the all the metabolic exchanges occur, and then this sediment is collected, and we do the culturing, we do the DNA extraction or the RNA extraction or the protein extraction to look into the various effects. These are those nodules which I told you, which would be a potential source of iron, manganese, cobalt, nickel in future. Government of India is mainly interested for nickel, because nickel and cobalt mainly, because we do not have any land mines of cobalt. Even for a simple X-ray, we are depending on imports of cobalt from the places where it is there. And yeah, this is a squid which we found in one of the multiplankton nets. This video may not play because I had some problem joining through my laptop, so I'll just skip this. And thank you for all. I think I finished on time, Sumit. So
Yeah, thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Damre, for a nice talk. And I must say the all the participants that how hard work can give the success in researcher's life. Samir is one of the examples, because I know Samir from last 15 to 16 years, and when I was in NIO, he used to work sleepless night in his laboratory, and for this, what he told that high pressure maintenance of the culture is how difficult. So, and I one of the person whom I know, Samir is one of them, that he is always positive. He never tell that it cannot be done. So this attitude is the first and foremost for any researcher, and Samir proved it in his career that high pressure these extremophils also can be cultured, and his group was the first in from Indian perspective in oceanographic science that they have published a lot of papers on that, and I'm very glad that Samir gave a talk on this forum, and I think young scholars or young students may also come to know that how vast is oceanography. It is not only about animals, not only about plants. There are microbiological aspects also can be explored. So I once again I thank Dr. Samir Damre for such an innovative talk. And I have personally two questions to Dr. Damre. So Samir, can these deep sea fungi has any drug or medicinal value or any potential?
Yeah, Sumit, so far we have explored them for the enzymes, but not explored for the drug or any other potential, basically because these are extremely difficult to culture. So now and previously, as you know, 25 years back, 20 years back, when we started our work, we did not have all these omic technologies here. So now my students are exploring with respect to the genome of these organisms. We have just started the whole genome sequencing of one of the deep sea organisms. So hopefully, years time we should close it, because eukaryotic sequencing is quite difficult. And then once we know that if we are able to do the gene mining, now the next project what we are working on is, we are not doing culturing. We are started with the metagenome, metatranscriptome, where we will be able to answer most of these questions if we can get the genes out, and we can clone them into an organism. Because it is not really it is okay for basic research to understand how the things work, but then if you are looking into the industrial production, it is not sustainable and practical to really grow them in the high pressure conditions, because it's extremely difficult to you never know when the drug will stop getting manufactured. It could be the pressure which is triggering it. So now that we are doing the gene studies, we will be in a better position to answer this maybe in a couple of years time. But as of now, nobody has explored these deep sea organisms for any drug related work. People have done with respect to enzymes mostly.
And I have another question, maybe not related to deep sea. Uh, what is your opinion that due to the global warming or climate change alteration, the frozen microbial community, do they have pose serious threat to mankind in coming decades? Because polars ice are melting, and we are getting everyday news about that. So, what is your opinion about this matter?
Yes, Sumit, that is really one of the scary things which we might have to face in future. And one example is like coronavirus, which we are facing now. And there could be lots of this kind of hidden microorganisms which are present there. And the moment they come into and they are able to colonize, because mostly you have a very balanced ecosystem. And if you have any outside organism which is able to colonize, it can play a havoc in the ecosystem which is there, especially in the food chain. And if it can uh, overcome the difficulties in growing, because see, basically they are embedded in ice for so long, so they will be having different mechanisms which there. And if they can adapt to the growing temperature conditions, and if they are able to sustain, then it will create issues in future for sure. There could be potential pathogens not only for human beings, there could be potential fish pathogens there, there could be potential plankton pathogens there. And this could
Yeah,
happen mainly with the viruses, because they are more adaptable, because basically they are not having complete machinery in themselves.
yeah. Okay, thank you, Samir. From my side, questions you answered, and now I
Yes.
will hand over to Momita for taking up the question from the chat box. Over to you, Momita.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Damre, for such an informative talk. And I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for giving an excellent coverage to the topic entitled Deep Sea Extreme Environment. So it was so fascinating how Dr. Damre enlightened us on this topic and made us aware of so many interesting and unknown facts regarding deep sea ecosystem and its extremities, as well as deep sea mining also. And not only that, he has made us aware of the opportunities in the careers of biological sciences also. So now it's time to move on to the question answer session. So we have received so many questions. So the first question is from Obik Mukherjee. He has asked that how can omic study be helpful to elucidate the mechanism of adaptability of various extremophiles?
Yeah, Avik, yeah, this is what I was talking when I was answering Sumit about the question about uh, how does it help. See, omics is basically you can do the studies without culturing, because culturing is one of the stumbling blocks in having any kind of deep sea work done. So with the omics, if you basically if you do a transcriptome studies, you will be able to understand the different kinds of genes which are being expressed by these organisms which are present in these conditions. And when you compare them across the terrestrial conditions, you will know exact difference between them. And but then I always say that only omics is not a real answer to all the questions, because moment you talk about adaptability, you need to have a control which is at the normal conditions. And with moment you see a difference in the profiles, it could be with respect to any gene or any protein which is present, you can say okay, this is the one which is responsible for the adaptability of these organisms in the extreme condition. It could be, and that is exactly what we are doing at present. A couple of papers would be out maybe in another 6 months time, where we are talking about the different kinds of proteins, not only the stress proteins, the normal proteins which are produced by the organisms. This is a part of a PhD work of one of my students, where we have shown the differences in the protein expression at the normal pressure and the increased pressure.
Okay. Question is from Shoumik Debnath. To collect deep sea samples for gene studies, as we know that the temperature, pressure are totally different. So does it create any extra problem?
Yeah, Samik, yeah, what you say is correct. You have different temperature and pressure, and when you get them on top for doing any kind of work, you are basically exposing it to the normal temperature and pressure. Temperature you can maintain more easily, because any kind of gene study, what we do, we collect and put them in -80 till the further processing. But when you are looking into the gene aspects, it doesn't make much of a difference, because genes themselves don't get affected by the depressurization. Of course, organisms through which they are present, but then if you are just going to study the metagenome, the meta work, it will not affect, and you can follow a simple gene extraction, the DNA extraction techniques. After, you can lyophilize or you can use the wet samples. So it will not create any problem if you are going to do any gene expression studies with these organisms, without the organism, just the genes which are present, the meta DNA work.
Okay. So the next question is from Momita Ghosh. Apart from low temperature and high pressure, is there any other stresses that make deep sea fungi vulnerable?
Yes, during my introductory slides, I introduced three stresses. One is temperature, one is pressure, and the another is the nutrient availability. So nutrient availability is one of the most important stresses which the organisms have to adapt themselves in the deep sea conditions. And that is where you find different Km values. We have done these studies in our laboratories, where the enzymes themselves exhibit different Km values under different pressures and the temperatures. So normally when we study, we have like, okay, enzyme has this Km value, but if you alter the conditions, you find different Km values, and that is how they respond to the metabolic challenges of the nutrient availability.
Okay. So next question, and this is the last question from Divisha Bishwas. She has asked, how do extremophiles tolerate acidic stress or metal toxicity at the depths?
Yeah, now when you are talking about the acidic stress, I guess you are talking with respect to the hydrothermal vent regions, where you might have slight acidic environment, because what see, the seawater pH is around 8.2 to 8.3, so there is no question of any acidic stress coming into this organisms at depth. But then there are some pockets where you might find like the vent regions. Then metal toxicity also similarly, as I was talking about this polymetallic nodules, there the metal localized metal concentrations are high, and the mechanisms which are exhibited by the organisms for the metal tolerance are very similar to the ones which are exhibited on the at the surface. So this could be because, as I was talking about the membrane fluidity, one of the tolerance mechanism is a transporter system which is present in the membranes. So because the organisms are having all other machineries functioning on the deep sea, they do not exhibit any special kind of stress tolerance to this acidic stress, which is most likely not there. But metal toxicity, yes. So it's the same what we see in the surface organisms. The transporter systems are the ones which are helping them to survive the metal toxicity.
Okay, sir, I'm going to end the question. Now this session will be available on our YouTube channel for further reference. On behalf of the high network faculty in Aquafield, I would like to express my gratitude to our eminent speaker, Dr. Damre, for giving his valuable time and sharing his thoughts and experiences. We are so honored to have you, sir. Finally, I extend a big thanks to all the members of Marine Ecology Laboratory for their continuous effort and hard work to make the session successful. Thanks to all the registered participants for their cooperation and support. So I would like to request all the participants to stay tuned at our website for upcoming events of this ongoing colloquium series, which will be held in following months and so on. So stay tuned and follow us for further updates and notification. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Samir.
Yeah, thank you, Sumit. Bye.